Hello, everybody. Today, I would like to present you with more evidence for evolution. And I want you to remember that the way we're looking at this is as follows. The theory of evolution proposes several hypotheses, and we can look at the data to see whether or not they support those hypotheses or refute them. Similarly, when you turn creationist ideas into hypotheses, we can look at their predictions, and we can look at whether the data supports them or refutes them. So let's continue. Last time we looked at fossils, now we're going to look at more evidence. The next question is, does homology occur? Evolution predicts that organisms should have many homologies. Why? Because they have common ancestors. And the common ancestors evolve new traits and then pass them on to their descendants. In contrast, in creationism, there's absolutely no reason for there to be homology. And similarities should be random and not suggest common ancestry. So what does the evidence show? Well, you already know what the evidence shows. It shows lots of homology. Here's just one of many examples in brain anatomy. Note how all the parts of the human brain are seen in lineages that branch from the evolutionary tree much earlier than humans have. It appears that the evolution of the brain in humans has occurred not by inventing new brain parts, but simply modifying the size and position of the fundamental parts that were laid down hundreds of millions of years ago. Why would a creator use the same brain parts for a mammal and a fish? Makes no sense. But it makes sense that evolution would tinker with the parts that are already there and slowly change them over. Similarly, the ultimate homology is cell structure. Plant and animal cells have many of the same organelles in common. They are homologous organelles. But think about plants and animals specifically. Why should these really different organisms have these similarities if not for common ancestry? You also have seen this earlier, where we have the forelimb, meaning the front limb of quadrupeds or tetrapods, being modified to form various things such as arms, front legs, flippers, and wings. And yet in every case, the same bones are modified. It makes no sense that if these were created de novo, from scratch, that you wouldn't create a skeletal structure that was particularly fit to flying or to swimming or to bearing weight. Similarly, there is not just similarity at the level of the morphology or the structure of the organism, it occurs at all levels. We have tons of biochemical similarities, and these include the same genetic material in all life, DNA, the same protein amino acids, and the basic synthesis machinery for proteins, the same enzymes and the same RNAs. We have the same genetic code throughout life, and we have homologous genes across very different organisms. And we're going to return to this more and more later on, but here's just one example. There's a gene for eye development called iris, and it is known from both fruit flies and mice. When it's mutated in both fruit flies and mice, eyes do not form. So some researchers took the mouse gene, clipped it out of a mouse cell, and put it into a fruit fly embryo. And what do you think happened? Did the fruit fly grow up with little mouse eyes? No, the fruit fly grew up with absolutely beautiful functional fruit fly eyes. The message of the mouse gene was understood by the fruit fly, meaning that it was the same chemistry. These were homologous genes. And that's really interesting because the common ancestor of fruit flies and mice occurred over 400 million years ago. Here's another idea that we can use to test evolution. Evolution predicts that as the environment changes over time, some features of organisms will no longer be useful. Since that feature that is no longer useful was once an integral part of the organism, we expect it to change slowly. And we predict that some species will show structures that are no longer useful but still present. And we call these vestigial structures. I bet you're all already thinking of some vestigial structures that you know about. Why do vestigial structures occur? Because they were inherited from an ancestor in which they were not vestigial. Creationism has no explanation for vestigial structures. Why would a designer put a non-functioning structure into an organism. Here's a great example of a vestigial structure. Whales still have their hip bones. You can see that these are hip bones. If you study the development of whales, if you look at the anatomy of whales, you can tell that these are the bones from the hip and the upper leg. And yet whales don't use them for swimming or for walking, and they're still there. We also know of vestigial genes. We know of many homologous genes, genes that are the same in many different species. We know this because they have similar genetic sequences and produce identical or nearly identical gene products, usually proteins. And here's an example of a homology. All of the great apes share the ABO blood type. That includes the 2 chimpanzees, the 2 or more species of gorillas, as well as the orangs, all share the ABO blood type. Because we can identify homologous genes, we have found many vestigial genes, genes that are present in the genome, still in the DNA, but are not used. In other words, they're not turned into gene products. Humans have about 1,000 unused genes in our genome that rodents use for smelling. We don't use them. They are vestigial. Next, embryological development. Embryological development is the development of the fertilized egg, that single cell when sperm penetrates egg and you now have a new being starting to develop. If evolution is true, we can make the following prediction. Differences within adult organisms must be built on top of the embryonic development that already exists. Thus, evolution predicts that all animals should share some common features of development. In addition, we can predict that traits that occur later in evolution should occur later in embryonic development and vice versa. Creationism predicts that development does not need to be similar in very different organisms. If species did not evolve, then there would be no reason for there to be similar development in, let's say, a fish and a mammal, in a reptile and an amphibian. And what do the embryos of vertebrates show? Well, you've already guessed it. At the early stages of embryonic development, all vertebrates, remember all the organisms that have backbones, develop gillarches. In fish and some amphibians, these arches become the gills. Let's take a look at them. Here we see the embryos in the early stage, the middle stage, and the late stage of 8 different organisms, from fish to salamander to tortoise to chicken to pig to cow to rabbit to human. These last 4 are mammals. Then we have 2 reptiles here, chicken and tortoise. We have an amphibian and we have fish. And look, here we have the gill arches that become the gills in this fish and in this salamander. And they also occur in all these organisms that do not have gills. So in all land animals, these structures are reabsorbed and repurposed into other structures, such as parts of the middle ear in mammal. Why should mammals have gill arches in the first place if they didn't come from a common ancestor? And if you're lucky, you might still have part of your gill arch, as one of my old students did. Other examples of telltale signs of evolution in embryonic development is, for example, humans have a tail during the embryo. Let's take a look at that. Here's an early human embryo, and the tail in rabbits, the tail in cows, the tail in pigs, all develop that way, except in humans that part falls off and is reabsorbed into the developing embryo. There are other examples. Leg buds in the embryos of snakes and whales occur and then are reabsorbed. Why would a creator put these features into embryos that don't need them? It makes no sense, but it does make a lot of sense if these things were inherited from an ancestor. I'll just leave you this slide to look at it for a second. Maybe you want to turn off the video and just stare at it. It's pretty amazing. And by the way, these drawings were from the late 1800s by a German who read Darwin's book and realized Darwin must have been right. The next thing is, can we actually observe natural selection? If evolution is true, we should be able to observe natural selection in real time. We should be able to see microevolution in action. And here's an example of the pepper and salt moth, Biston betullaria, which has a light and a dark color form. After industrialization in England, when trees lost their lichens and became darker due to all the soot, the percentage of dark morphs increased. And you can see that The dark morphs became particularly prevalent in industrialized eastern England, where all the coal was being born. And in western England, where there wasn't much industrialization, the light morphs still predominated. Now, since pollution has been cleaned up with clean air laws, the lichens have returned, and the light-colored form is once again more prevalent. Here's another example of the observation of natural selection. On the island of Daphne Major, there is a 6 to 8 month dry season during which no new seeds are produced. Now, one finch named Geospiza fortis has to survive on the seeds it can find during this dry period. There is variation from year to year in the seed sizes that are produced and therefore available for the finch to eat. Birds with larger beaks are better able to open and eat large seeds, while those with smaller beaks are better able to extract small seeds from the crevices in the lava. In 1976, many large seeds were produced as a result of a drought and relatively few small seeds. The prediction was that small-beaked finches would suffer greater mortality and subsequent populations would have larger beaks. What happened? Here you can see it. The blue represents the 1976 bill size in the population. And then here it is, the 1978 bill size, which you can see the average had increased by over 1 millimeter in beak depth. That's natural selection in action, and this has continued to be observed on Daphne Major since then. So our summary is the hypothesis of evolution makes many predictions, and the evidence supports them. In contrast, creationism doesn't make a prediction in many cases, and when it does, those are not supported. Some creationists contend that the creator can do anything, and so everything is the way it should be, but that means that creationism cannot make testable hypotheses, and therefore is not science. Thus, it is useless as a way to guide our thinking about the physical earth. At this point, evolution is a fact. You may remember that a scientific fact is any well-supported hypothesis by the evidence. So evolution, the change in animal species over time and the creation of new species from a single population, is a fact because there are so many predictions that have been met and so much data that refutes creationism that we can't imagine we're now going to find new data that will cause us to say, oh, we were wrong. It's been really well supported and we call it a fact. The data is also consistent with the hypothesis that all life currently on Earth came from a single common ancestor, which is interesting. That's not a necessary condition of evolution, but that's what the data shows. Before we finish this, I just want to talk about some misconceptions in evolution, and we'll talk about them further in class. You've already seen some of the misconceptions in the quiz we took at the beginning of this unit. But if you use the logic of common ancestry and tree thinking and combine it with the logic of natural selection, both of which you understand pretty well right now, you can usually steer clear of most of the pitfalls. So I'm just going to present you right now with these statements, and I want you to evaluate them in terms of whether they're true or false. You may want to turn off the video after each one and make your evaluation. A larger individual animal is more likely to survive because it will be stronger. The goal of evolution is to create intelligent species. All species have evolved a useful role in the ecosystem. A species that is nearly extinct is much more likely to evolve a new trait that helps it survive than a species that has a large population. So think about all of those and see if you can tell me whether they're true or they're false. I'm going to present you with a few more. Since every adaptation makes a species better suited to its environment, species are getting better or more perfect over time. A new trait often evolves because it is necessary for the survival of the species. Since mutation is a random event, the traits that are selected for are a random sample of all mutations. So once again, try to think through those and see if you can tell me whether they are true or false. And not only that, but why they are true or false. Before Darwin, biology was a religious undertaking. People became biologists because they sought to understand the creator by understanding the creator's creation. But after Darwin, evolution provided the overarching framework into which all of biology must fit. Evolution explains so many patterns in fact in biology that would otherwise have no reason other than the whim of a creator. For example, why all mammals have backbones and they share that characteristic with fish. At this point, all biological knowledge must also make sense in evolutionary terms. And as a very famous early evolutionary biologist, Theodosius Dobzhansky, said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So that's it for today. Next time, we will be talking about the classification of organisms and applying the idea of evolution and the knowledge of evolution to how we classify organisms. Until then, go outside, observe nature, and ask biological questions. And I'll see you soon.